Hello, my name is Laurel Ruma. I'm with O'Reilly Media, and today we are talking with Camille Fournier, who is the head of platform engineering at Two Sigma, a New York City hedge fund. She is also the author of The Manager's Path and was the CTO for Rent the Runway. Hello, Camille.
Hi.
Great to talk to you today. So, I want to start with a very important question for you. What is the difference between being a leader and being a manager?
Well, you can be a leader without being a manager. They're not the same thing. Leadership comes in a lot of different forms. So you see a lot of people who are leaders because they, inspire people. They show people, a path forward, a way to get something done. They influence the way a group behaves. And none of those things really directly requires you to be a manager. Managers are directly responsible usually for a group of people in some fashion, right? So, um, depending on depending on the company, depending on where you're working, as a manager, you may be responsible for actually, assigning work to people, or you may just be responsible for making sure that your organization is productive, that you're hiring people, that you're helping develop their career paths, what have you. But it is a distinct position that really is directly about helping the people in an organization do their jobs better, which is not, that's not the only thing that leadership is about.
Great. How long have you been a manager?
I've been a manager on and off for, I guess, about 10 years now.
And what was your path to management like?
So my very first time managing, I was a senior engineer on a small team of mostly fairly senior people. And the person who had been managing that team pulled me aside and said, "Look, I'd like you to be the tech lead, and I'd actually like for you to manage some of the people on the team as part of that role." And I was sort of flattered and intimidated to have been asked to take this position, but I think that he knew that I needed an opportunity to grow and stretch myself in a few ways. And this company, it was fairly common and kind of expected for you to manage a few people as you sort of progressed in your career. So even though I was pretty sure at that time I wanted to stay really as an individual contributor, I took on the role to kind of get some of that experience, as well as, I think he believed it would make me a more effective tech lead.
How'd it work?
It worked okay, but I think that it was really very much baby steps management. I had a lot of support from him. He had been the manager of this team, and he was a very experienced, engineer and leader, and had been around this company for a long time. And I didn't have that many people. I probably had, I don't know, three people reporting to me. So it was a very, very small group of people that I had to actually quote unquote manage. And, it was a big established company. So there was a lot of sort of established processes and support for managing, that like I wasn't just sort of having to figure out how to do everything. That being said, I think I was, like okay, but not spectacular at it. I did it for, I don't know, probably a year or year and a half maybe. And but I was really eager to get back into an individual contributor role. I didn't really think of myself at that point as being on the manager's path, as it were.
When you did think about yourself, or even in that first year, did you look to any resources outside what the company was kind of already providing you? Like, did you kind of think to yourself, "Oh, wow, now's the time I should start reading all those management books," or we're kind of like, "Oh, this is good. I know the people. I know what I'm expected to do. I'm just going to do it."
Yeah, no, I did. I definitely talked to friends of mine who had managed before and asked them a lot of questions about like what should I be doing, what should I be reading, what should I expect. I'm sure I read a couple of books at the time to try to do a better job. We had some training as well within the company that I believe I took to try to just like understand like how to write performance reviews
Mm.
and things like that. So I definitely reached out to some external resources. And in fact, I would say that when I returned to management a couple of years after that and was really managing larger and larger teams, I really reached out to a lot of external resources and started really reading a lot about management and talking to a lot of friends and people in my network on how they do it and how should I be doing it and how do I do this well.
What were some of those resources? Like, how did you start thinking that you were like needed to ask for help?
Let's see. Well, I mean, I think at the time I probably read a lot of blog posts It's been a while. It's kind of hard to remember because it was just such a crazy period of life for me because my second major management experience was really at a startup, and so that's just a very intense environment as you are learning to manage because you don't really have nearly as much support around you in terms of like HR and training and experienced managers and the way the company does things. You're kind of making it all up yourself. So that was the point where I really realized, my gosh, I need a lot of help. I need a lot of resources. I actually had a coach at the time, and she was incredibly helpful in pointing out really more on the leadership side resources. But, resources, a lot of what I learned, at least in the first few years of management, was really about controlling my own reactions to things and how to just like listen better to people and understand what motivated them and understand what they were looking for and kind of just like calm down. And I think that was at the time that was really what I got from reading and coaching was really like just kind of an approach to thinking about how to interact with people, a little bit of thinking about how to like organize teams in a general sense and things like that. What I didn't find a ton of was advice on managing engineers specifically, and that's actually part of why I ended up writing the book after I left that CTO job. Was that I felt like there wasn't a ton of resources out there that were really about kind of the nuts and bolts of like, so you're a manager of a bunch of engineers. What did you expect to do? What are some of the unique challenges to this job?
Yeah. So, what are some of those unique challenges and like obstacles maybe that you found early on that you kind of wished you had a little bit more like support with?
Yeah, so I think that some of the challenges I found early on were it's very hard to make the transition from writing a lot of code all the time and really thinking about software and systems to managing and leading people specifically. And so, getting like figuring out how to kind of go through that transition of just being able to really understand the details of all of the software that your team is writing because that's you helped write it and you worked on it, and moving out of that into a place where like you don't have the time to read all the code. You're not necessarily doing all of the code reviews or reviewing all of the systems. You just kind of have to trust your team to do it right because you can't possibly, try to control everything. I think that was one of the major challenges for me, and something that maybe that's not unique to tech exactly, but I think it's certainly a unique challenge where you really get a lot of your value and confidence out of the technical part where you can see yourself accomplishing something. You're working and then you finish it and you launch it, and your customers are using it or whatever. That's a very different cycle and feedback loop than management, and that can be a very challenging transition, I think, for new managers in engineering.
How do you know that you are a good manager? You talked a lot about, getting help from other folks and kind of having a support network and some mentorship, but like, how do you actually hit your stride?
Yeah, I mean, how do you know you're a good manager? I think in some ways, like people have to tell you.
Yeah.
you know, um, I think over time, you're a good manager when people you used to manage come to you for advice or guidance, even though you don't manage them anymore. That's a good sign. That means that they found your insights valuable as a manager, and they would like to get them again. I think that's a great sign. I think you're a good manager. Some of it is just that your team clicks, right? If your team is really like doing well. They seem to be gelled and happy and working well together and focused. That can be a sign that you're doing well as a manager, because usually you are having to do something to create and sustain that kind of system. I think different people and different circumstances, there's different definitions of what we need in a good manager, right? Some circumstances, you need a good manager who's really good at getting people to work on things they don't necessarily want to work on because that's just what needs to be done. In some circumstances, you really need a manager who's really good at hiring people, coaching them to like do better. That's generally important, but it's more important, if you're trying to really grow a team quickly. It's hard because like what is a good engineer? You can be a good engineer in a lot of different ways. So there are some good engineers who are really good at debugging problems, and there are some engineers who are really good at making new things. There's some engineers who are really good at scaling things, and they're not always necessarily all good at the same thing. And I think that's actually true for managers as well, that every manager is sort of good at some things and not at others. But the basics are really that, your team trusts you and that you create an environment where people feel good about coming to work as much as you have the power to create that. And that, they feel like they can rely on you to help them do their jobs well as a team.
We talk a lot kind of about being a manager for a team, but then how do you kind of go across the organization? Like, that's also another challenge that new managers kind of have to think about too, right? So it's not just how well, you can manage your team and how well they click. It's also your ability to then click with a larger team and with your direct manager. So I know that kind of takes us into a tangent, but it made me really think like these are skills that you also need to apply across the organization as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think different managers do this differently. For me, it's always about having a sense, the better sense you have of the direction that your team is going in or should be going in and how it fits into the larger organization. I think that helps you work better across the team. I certainly, I find that as a manager of managers at this point in my career, what I really want from the people who work for me is not just that they are really doing a good job of getting their teams to be, again, happy and productive and, building good systems, but also that they have a strong sense of where they fit in to the larger picture and that they have good enough relationships with their peers that they can identify like, oh, we're actually working on something that's similar, maybe we should join forces, or they can identify, hey, like you could use this thing that we just built to do your job better, or whatever, right? So I think that is part of that is a pretty important part of management, is being able to see yourself in the larger picture of the teams around you. And that's part of why we need managers, is that it's very hard to both be in the very, very deep details of a piece of software as an individual contributor engineer, and have the time to get the context to see the teams around you and what they're doing. It's really hard to do both of those things. I don't think most people can do both of those things successfully. So you need both kinds of people to make a healthy engineering team. You need a lot of people who are really in the details, making sure they're building really great software, attending to like, where does this run? How does this scale? Et cetera, et cetera. And you need people who, get the gist of that, but also understand like, oh, okay, like, we own these systems. And the reason we own these systems is because, they support this other thing. And, I should be partnering really well with that other team because that's where we're going to find the next things we need to build, and kind of be looking out for other opportunities for our stuff to be useful or for us to be adding more value to the company.
That's really good way of kind of saying it, because that's also the skills that probably other people look out for and what your manager saw in you, like the ability to not only just lead a team of people doing very detailed work, but then also be able to communicate with the rest of the organization of how the team is doing. And, being able to communicate both of those directions is very important.
Yeah.
So, what kind of advice do you have for people who are new managers other than just read your book?
So I always have a lot of advice for people who are new managers, and it kind of depends on what they're struggling with. But my basic fundamental advice is, so one piece of it is build up your network of other managers, and that can include finding a manager mentor somewhere. This is a good time to look for mentorship, because mentorship is very useful when you're learning a new skill set, and there's a lot of opportunities for you to there's a lot of things that you don't necessarily know the answer to, and you're going to have like specific questions to ask. I think that that's a time when mentorship can be very, very valuable. So if you can find a mentor somewhere, that can be very useful. But beyond that, like having a group of trusted peers that are perhaps also managers, maybe at your company, but maybe even outside of your company, where you can just bounce situations off of and kind of do peer mentoring, I think is so valuable for really gut checking you, because nobody knows how to do everything, and like each of us has different strengths and different skills, and so much of management is like, I've never been in this situation and I have to figure out what to do. But if I know someone else who has been in that situation, they can tell me what they did and kind of what went well and what didn't, and that can help me maybe approach it in a little bit more of a savvy way. So that's one of my major pieces of advice for new managers. And then and then my other piece of advice for new managers, and this is always somewhat controversial, is that, you do want to stay somewhat technical. It sort of depends on the size of your team. If you've got a team that's so big that you are neglecting important parts of your management job to write code, then that's probably not a good idea. But I do think that sometimes people get the impression that the minute you start managing people, you should kind of wash your hands of all the technical stuff and stop writing code and stop worrying about that. And I don't think that that is a very successful path to follow in the tech industry, frankly. I think that, we appreciate managers who understand the details of our work. We want a manager who, because our managers are evaluating us often, right? Whether you do 360 reviews or promotion committees or whatever, at the end of the day, your manager does have an important evaluative role for you in terms of like whether you're doing a good job or not. And if your manager, if you're an engineer and you work for a manager who doesn't understand technology at all or who has been hands off for so long that they really just don't appreciate anything about what you're doing, I think it can be very demoralizing to feel like the person who's evaluating me is just not really in a position necessarily to be able to understand what I do. This is not to say that like every manager of engineers must be super technical. I know actually some great managers of engineers who are not necessarily former engineers, but they spent a lot of time around technical architecture and a lot of time working very closely with engineers. So they still get it and they still actually can kind of appreciate a lot of the technology, and they partner with other senior technical folks to kind of close those gaps. But in general, I think if you are an engineer and you have become a manager and you have in the past been building systems or what have you, don't do that to the exclusion of ignoring the important parts of your job that involve managing people. But don't be so quick to just abandon all of the technical parts of your job that you really just kind of lose touch with all things technical, because that's still important.
Yeah, certainly when you're, like you said, in that position where, I don't know, I think engineers may be I'd say a special breed, but that's not really fair. Everyone wants the people around them to understand the difficult nature of their work and just appreciate what they're doing and what it takes to get from A to B.
Yeah.
Well, Camille, thank you so much for talking with us today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.